Good day to you. This sermon recap is for Proper 28, the year B, the year of Mark, preached at University Lutheran, November 18th, the year 2012. We're about wrapping up the church year, the year B, the year of Mark. And we got Christ the King Sunday coming up, and then that ends this year, and then we begin the church year, lectionary year C. Luke's Gospel, that always begins the first Sunday in Advent, which this year is December 2nd. So things are wrapping up here in Mark. It's kind of a bit disjointed because we end the Gospel, we end the liturgical year here as Jesus is in Jerusalem ready to die, and we'll pause then, we stop that, and move to Luke in Christmas and Advent, but let's finish up here. We get in Mark what's called the little apocalypse. That's not quite probably the best term, but at least gives us a sense of that there's a switch in Mark. Chapter 13, as Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." While Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished." Then Jesus said to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This Sunday comes the week of Thanksgiving, so I use the sermon as a bit of a pre-Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving sermon in doing it this way. I told a fun story that my very first car was my grandpa's last car, or better said, that my grandpa's last car was my first car. It was a 1967 Chevelle. I bought it from my grandpa, my dad's dad, nicknamed her Bessie, which was my grandmother's first name, Bessie Rose. Sixta or Buresh. 1967 Chevelle, turquoise in and out. A straight block, 231 six-cylinder, manual transmission, 3 on the tree. It was a cool car, except that it was a 4-door. And so I said in my teenage exuberance, I wanted in the worst way that the car should be red, and more specifically, maroon, because I thought the chicks would dig a red car. And here in my late 40s, here I'm driving a red car again. But anyway, started the sermon asking how many folks have ever heard of Earl Scheib. Earl Scheib was a body shop in a number of states. I've Googled it, and it has since gone out of business or been consumed by another company. But they would do these specials where they would paint a car for $99 or $49 or something like that. And so I had my grandpa's car, now my car, turquoise inside and out, painted, at least on the outside, maroon. And then told the story that I met my folks. We met my folks in Des Moines. It was halfway somehow between Omaha and Rochester, and for whatever reason, Bessie had the Chevelle washed. And it was one of those washes where you get out of the car, and the car is pulled through the wash by some kind of conveyor system, and that you got out of the car and you stood with all the other washees looking through these giant windows, and that typically you walk along, I don't know why, but you walk along with your car and you see the car go through all these assorted brushes, some spinning this way, some spinning this way, you know what I mean. And as I walked alongside my car, Bessie, I began to notice as the car wash was underway that I was hoping I was mistaken, but began to see some turquoise showing through the maroon. And sure enough, as the car made its way through, Earl Scheib's paint job began to my $49 special or $99 special began to wear off, and then in a stroke of awfulness that pains me even to talk about, then as the car got near the end of the car wash, some of the side trim began to peel off, and by the brushes, and so that the workers of the car wash had to make their way back through the brushes, risk the brushes, and pick up different pieces of my car and hand to me as the car got to the end, and as they toweled it off so that I could take all my spare parts and throw them in the trunk and drive off with now this turquoise stripe down the side. All of that to say that God's people as a foundation are thankful. So to talk about surfaces, to talk about what's under the surface, and to talk about boundaries that fall in pleasant places. The psalm yesterday was Psalm 16. I'll leave that to you to read. It's one of my favorite psalms in kind of an obscure way. I've used it preached on it for funerals, actually for a wedding. There is this sense that it is part of the memory of God's people of Israel. It's part of the memory of God's people as Christ ones, as disciples of Christ, that when God is with us, when Christ is with us, God with us in Emmanuel, that we are overall thankful. That we give thanks, that we give praise, that we that part of who we are, the makeup of who we are, is that we give thanks. And so to have a holiday that allows us in kind of a civil way to say thanks, to give thanks, is a good thing. And so I encouraged my people, just like I encouraged the students last Wednesday, two things. Make a list, consider, ponder the things that you're thankful to God for, and say those things in prayer, in praise, and thanksgiving. And then also maybe pick one person or two people that you haven't thanked in a while that you think you ought to thank, and not only text or not only message or Facebook or email, but hand scribble a note and say thank you to them. It's a good thing to say thanks. Psalm 16 again says that the boundaries have fallen for us in pleasant places as God's people, and that we ought to be careful and faithful to say so to God and to one another. But here's where that little car illustration comes in, that it's one of my sayings these last months, more and more, that if you take any of us on any given day and just scratch beneath the surface, if you just scrape below the facade or the veneer, not in a negative way, as if we put on airs, but most of us, any of us on any given day, if we scratch beneath that surface, we find pain and we find hurt and we find doubt and we find sadness. That I didn't want anybody to have the sense that Thanksgiving was only for other folks whose lives seem to be and appear to be calm and going well. That any of us, all of us, I think, I certainly have known it in my life, I've known it in lots of saints' lives, that behind this way that we live our lives and that we present ourselves, just behind that is not a chaos, that's a bit too strong of a word, but something like a chaos. And that even the gospel, this mini apocalypse, says to us that we as Christians, we as Christ ones, in most general ways, are not excused from suffering, and we as Christians in some very particular ways, in fact, are guaranteed. We're assured that we will suffer. And so suffering somehow cannot be seen as reason not to praise, or suffering cannot be seen as in some way that God is displeased or withdrawn from you. And in fact, the apocalypse, any kind of apocalyptic material, wants to say, in the midst of sufferings, somehow we have to make sense of it in a way in faith, in seeing God in the midst of it. So that was my second point, that just beneath the surface of most of us, on any given day, in any given moment, in any given stage of life, there is a sadness or a suffering. So, on to the third point then, and this is where our Wednesday morning group sat a lot to say that in the midst of suffering then, another scrape of the maroon that shows the turquoise of hope. That suffering makes in us, in some ways, for us to do the work of faith. That we simply do faith. That we simply encourage faith. The second lesson was from Hebrews that says, do not, because Jesus who makes the promise, because God who makes the promise is faithful, we should encourage one another over and over to do good things, to not neglect meeting as some have done, but that part of what we do in the midst of thanksgiving and suffering, and under suffering, this hope is simply to go about the business of faith. It's not very romantic, it's not very sexy, but simply to be about the business of faith. When in doubt, do faith. When in doubt, do the next good work. When in doubt, forgive and feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the stranger. That when in doubt, even in the midst of suffering, that if you scrape there along suffering, if you scrape there along sadness, if you scrape there along mourning, there comes in the people of God hope. There comes in the people of God faith. And so then we return back to this idea, then comes again with one another, with the Christ, who speaks these words just moments, just weeks, days in his last week. He speaks these words just days before being crucified. That this Jesus gives us, lends us, grants us his faith, his hope, his thanksgiving. So, kind of a three-point thing. That one of the basics of who we are as Christ ones, we give thanks. Beneath that thanks, there is suffering sometimes, sadness. Beneath that sadness and suffering, to scrape the maroon away, we have the turquoise of hope that grants faith, that grants thankfulness again. A most blessed Thanksgiving to you. Godspeed if you're traveling in these days. Grace and peace, be well.